In April 1966, a five-man patrol from 3 Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment crept out of the Australian base at Nui Dat and disappeared into the jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province. They carried no machetes, they were moving through some of the densest vegetation in Southeast Asia, and they carried no machetes. Instead, each man had a pair of pruning shears and a small folding saw. The idea was brutally simple. A machete makes noise, shears don't. And in the jungle of South Vietnam, noise was a death sentence. Those 5 men were about to make history, not through a famous battle, not through a political decision, through a set of ideas about how to fight, what to carry, and how to move, ideas so effective that the North Vietnamese army gave the Australians a name they reserved for no other enemy force. They called them the Ma Rừng, the ghosts of the jungle. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam with a resume that most American units didn't have. The regiment had been founded in 1957, modeled on the British SAS. By the time it reached Vietnam, its corps officers and NCOs had already fought in Borneo against Indonesian-backed insurgents, honing their skills in another triple canopy jungle war that most Americans knew nothing about. They had spent nearly a decade doing exactly what they were now being asked to do, moving invisibly through rainforest, gathering intelligence, and disappearing before the enemy could respond. The jungle, to them, wasn't an obstacle, it was the weapon. Their base was SAS Hill, a position carved out of the high ground at Nui Dat. From there, the 3 Sabre squadrons, 1, 2, and 3, rotated through yearly tours. Between April 1966 and October 1971, those 3 squadrons conducted 1,175 patrols across Phuoc Tuy, Bien Hoa, Long Con, and Binh Tuy provinces. Some 580 men in total passed through the regiment during those 5 years. In that time, 492 enemy fighters were confirmed killed, with another 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, and 11 captured. Against those numbers, the SASR lost exactly 1 man killed in action, 1 who died of wounds, 3 in accidents, 1 missing, and 1 to illness. 28 men were wounded. Run those numbers again. Nearly 600 enemy killed, 6 Australian combat deaths. That is not a kill ratio. That is something that doesn't have a name. The question no one ever fully answers is how. And the answer starts not with heroism or luck, but with gear. With the exact, specific tools these men chose to carry, and the ones they chose to leave behind. Begin with the rifle. The standard Australian Army service weapon in Vietnam was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a British pattern variant of the Belgian Fien Fal. It was a fine weapon for conventional warfare. For the deep penetration patrols the SASR ran, it was a liability. The L1A1 was semi-automatic only, too long, too heavy, and its flash hider caught on jungle vines. SAS armorers addressed these problems systematically. Flash hiders came off. Barrels were cut down, sears were adjusted to allow full automatic fire. The weapon became shorter, faster, and quieter to carry through dense brush. Some operators went further. A handful of troopers modified their rifles so radically that the resulting weapon acquired its own name. They called it the Bitch. Built primarily from the heavy barrel L2A1 automatic variant, the Bitch had its barrel cut off right in front of the gas block, its bipod removed, and a 40mm grenade launcher bolted to the bottom rail where the bipod had been. That launcher was the XM-148, an experimental Colt design that the U.S. military had contracted in July 1966. The Americans eventually rejected the XM-148 in favor of the M203. It was too complicated, too difficult to clean in the field. But the SASR didn't care about the maintenance manual. They cared about the effect. A single patrol member could now lay down automatic rifle fire and 40mm grenades from one weapon, without carrying 2. In a 5-man patrol 100 kilometers from help, that mattered. Then there was the submachine gun. Sergeant Neville Farley was photographed in 1967, preparing for a mission. A silent Sterling 9mm submachine gun in his hands, and a loaded Beretta pistol in the pouch on his hip. The Sterling had been the standard British Army submachine gun since the early 1950s. In SASR hands, fitted with a suppressor, it became a tool for a very specific purpose. In situations where a patrol needed to eliminate a sentry or break contact without triggering a full enemy response, the suppressed Sterling could reduce the acoustic signature of a shot to something that might be mistaken, from a distance, for the crack of a branch. It wasn't silent, no suppressed weapon is, but in the chaos of a jungle contact, the difference between a full-volume rifle shot and a muffled report could determine whether reinforcements came. The SASR also carried gear that the Americans weren't using. British 1944 pattern pouches, modified with locally purchased hardware, gave them load-bearing systems that sat differently on the body than American M1956 webbing, keeping weight off the front to allow the operator to go prone silently without equipment scraping the ground. Claymore mine pouches doubled as convenient general-purpose carriers for extra ammunition and medical supplies. Men purchased items privately, at their own expense, when the issued version didn't suit the mission. When you are 5 men in enemy territory with no immediate backup, you optimize everything down to the last buckle. But the gear was only part of the equation. What set the SASR apart, what gave their equipment its meaning, was the philosophy governing how they used it. They moved slowly. That's the word that appears again and again in the accounts of men who served with them, and the enemies who hunted them. Slowly. A patrol might cover only a few hundred meters in an hour. Each footfall was placed, not taken. Vegetation was parted with pruning shears, not cut. Shears make no sound. A machete does. The patrol absorbed each section of terrain before crossing it, listening, observing, taking in the smell of the air before committing weight to a new position. When they made contact with the enemy, the transformation was instantaneous. The slow, silent ghost became a wall of fire. The doctrine called for each 5-man patrol to create the impression of a much larger force, to lay down so much fire in the opening seconds of contact that the enemy instinctively went to ground, bought the patrol time to maneuver, time to break contact, time to call in support. In firefight after firefight, it worked. Even experienced Viet Cong units, men who had spent years in the jungle, who knew every trail, who understood ambush craft, would encounter an SASR patrol, and in the words of communist military histories, assumed they were facing Viet Kick, an elite commando force of significantly larger size. The Americans noticed. In 1967, SASR operators began providing instruction to American long-range reconnaissance patrol students at the Mac Recondo School. The techniques being taught, the slow movement, the radio silence, the specific patterns of gear selection, were directly derived from what had worked in Borneo, refined in Vietnam. American ORI-RP units operating alongside SASR patrols on joint operations reported the experience as transformative. In early September 1967, patrols from one squadron worked alongside LRRP personnel from the 101st Airborne Division, giving the Americans direct exposure to the doctrine in practice. The SASR also ran operations that fell completely outside the conventional playbook. In 1968, 2 squadron executed Operation Overboard, stretching fishing nets across a river to physically intercept a sampan being used by the Viet Cong to resupply their forces. The operation worked. The sampan was captured. The VC supply line was disrupted. It isn't the sort of operation that appears in any U.S. Army field manual. It is the sort of operation that only occurs to men who have completely internalized the jungle as a problem-solving environment, who look at a river and see not an obstacle but a tool. The man who most embodied what the SASR brought to Vietnam didn't wear a regiment flash. He wore the uniform of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, the ATV, and his name was Rain Stewart Simpson. Ray Simpson had been born in 1926 in Chippendale, Sydney. His mother disappeared when he was 5. He was separated from his siblings and placed in an orphanage. He left school at 12. At 18, he joined the Army. By the time he reached Vietnam, he had fought in the Pacific, in Korea, and in the Malayan Emergency. He had been one of the original members of the first SAS company in 1957. He was, by any measure, a man the Army had forged over 3 decades. By May 1969, Simpson was 43 years old, a warrant officer Class II commanding the 232nd Company of the Mobile Strike Force in Kontum Province, near the Laotian border. On May 6th, one of his platoons was pinned down by heavy fire. Simpson led the rest of his company forward, deliberately placing himself in front of his troops to draw enemy attention onto himself. An Australian fellow officer was critically wounded. Simpson crossed open ground under fire to reach him, picked him up and carried him to safety. He then crawled forward to within 10 meters of the enemy position and threw grenades into it. When darkness fell, he ordered his men to withdraw, picked up another wounded colleague, and personally covered the company's retreat with smoke grenades until the last man was clear. 5 days later, on May 11th, the same operation took another turn. The battalion commander was killed. Multiple casualties were lying exposed in the open. Simpson went forward alone, positioned himself between the enemy fire and the wounded men, and held the enemy back, alone, while the casualties were evacuated. He did not leave his position until every wounded man was clear. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. He was 43 years old. He died of cancer in Tokyo in 1978 and was buried at the Yokohama War Cemetery. What the SASR achieved in Vietnam was the product of a doctrine that had been evolving for nearly 20 years before the first patrol stepped off at Nui Dat. It began in Malaya, it sharpened in Borneo, and it reached its fullest expression in the jungles of Phuoc Tui. The gear, the shears, the silenced Sterlings, the butchered rifles, the hand-selected British pouches, was not incidental to that doctrine. It was the physical expression of it. Every item carried by an SASR trooper on a deep penetration patrol had been chosen by a man who had thought carefully about what weight costs in a jungle environment, what noise costs, and what speed means when the nearest friendly unit is an hour away by helicopter. The NVA studied the Australians. Communist military records describe an almost tangible anxiety about SASR presence in an area. Patrols were modified, routes were changed. Units that had moved openly through Phuoc Tu began to move with more caution, not because of American firepower, not because of air support, but because of 5 men with pruning shears who might be anywhere. There is something both remarkable and terrible about that. Remarkable because it demonstrates what a small, highly trained force can do when doctrine and equipment align perfectly. Terrible because the enemy that feared them most was an enemy also fighting for survival in their own land. By October 1971, the last Australian patrol had come back in. The SAS Hill was dismantled. The 3 Sabre squadrons returned to Perth. The war they had fought, quiet, slow, lethal, was not the war that would be remembered. The photographs that define Vietnam in public memory were of napalm and helicopters, of massive search and destroy operations, of a war fought at scale. The SASR's war was fought at a whisper. 5 men, 100 kilometers of jungle, pruning shears, and a kill ratio that to this day has never been explained to any observer's full satisfaction. If you want to understand more about how Allied Special Forces fought the Vietnam War from the shadows, there's a video on screen right now that goes deeper. And if this story made you think about the war differently, subscribe. There are more of these stories. They deserve to be heard.